The wind had a way of carrying secrets across the desert. It swept through the scrub brush and over the sand like a whisper, tugging at the shutters of Eli Monroe's trading post, rattling the bottles on the shelves, and stirring the dust that clung to every corner of that lonely patch of land. It was the spring of 1882, and the New Mexico territory was not kind to dreamers. Clara Monroe was 17, too young to have lines of worry on her brow, yet they had already settled there. Her mother had died 2 winters ago, and her father had been different since. The warmth that once filled their home had given way to the sour smell of whiskey and the desperate sound of dice clattering on tables at the saloon. Every night, Eli returned later, and every morning the debts grew higher. That day, the desert heat shimmered like glass as Clara wiped down the counter of the trading post. She'd grown used to the solitude, days filled with the rustle of wind and the occasional trader passing through on horseback. But the unease that had settled in her father's eyes lately gnawed at her. Something was coming. Eli burst through the door before noon, face flushed, hands trembling. "Clara," he barked, "put on your mother's shawl. We've got company." She froze, rag still in hand. Company was rare this far from the nearest town. When she peeked out the window, she saw him, a tall Apache man dismounting from a painted horse, his movements slow and deliberate. His skin was bronzed by the sun, his hair long and bound in a simple braid, and his eyes, amber, sharp, and unreadable, met hers with a calm that made her heart thud uneasily. "His name's Taza," Eli muttered, brushing his hat against his knee. "He's here to do business." Clara said nothing. She didn't trust the tone in her father's voice. Taza entered quietly, ducking his head under the low doorway. His presence filled the room, silent, steady, like a mountain that had walked in from the desert. He spoke English, though with the rhythm of a man who used few words. "I come for the trade," he said. Eli nodded quickly, eager. "A fair one, I promise you." The 2 men talked for nearly an hour, their voices low and tense. Clara stood by the shelves, pretending to rearrange jars of coffee beans while trying to catch fragments of their conversation. She heard words like debt, ranch, and agreement, but it wasn't until Eli turned toward her, his expression caught between guilt and resolve, that the truth began to sink in. "Clara," he said, clearing his throat, "you'll be leaving with Mr. Taza come morning." She blinked, not understanding. "Leaving where?" "With him," he said flatly. "He's agreed to take you. In exchange, he's wiping out my debts." The room tilted. The rag slipped from her hand. "You sold me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Eli's jaw tightened. "It ain't like that. He's a good man, quiet, got land and stock. Better life than this." "Better life?" she shouted, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You're selling your own daughter." Taza stood silent through it all, his expression unreadable. When she turned to him, her anger turned to something colder, fear. He was older than her father by a few years, maybe 40, though his face carried the stillness of someone carved by time and war. "Tell him I'm not going," she said fiercely, glaring at her father, but Eli couldn't meet her eyes. He poured himself a drink instead, muttering, "It's done." That night, Clara packed her mother's blue shawl, a worn Bible, and the small silver locket she'd kept since childhood. She didn't cry again. Her tears had dried into anger and disbelief. She sat by the window, staring out at the desert moon, listening to the faint murmur of Taza and her father speaking outside. She caught only fragments: peace, honor, not slave. Before dawn, she was roused by the sound of horses. Taza stood outside with 2 saddled mounts, his expression solemn. Her father didn't come to see her off. She waited for him to step through the door, to stop this madness, but the silence stretched on. Finally, she lifted her chin, tied the shawl around her shoulders, and walked past the only home she'd ever known. They rode in silence. The land stretched out endlessly. Miles of crimson earth and stony ridges, broken only by the cry of hawks and the occasional tumbleweed crossing their path. Clara's body ached from the saddle, her thoughts circling like vultures. Every time she looked at Taza, he seemed lost in thought, his face turned toward the horizon. At midday, they stopped near a dry creek bed. Taza dismounted and handed her a canteen. "Drink," he said simply. She snatched it, glaring. "Why'd you do it?" she demanded. "Why buy me?" He paused, his gaze steady. "Your father offered." "I accepted." "That's not an answer," she snapped. "What are you going to do with me?" He studied her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Nothing you do not choose, her anger faltered. You don't mean to. No, he interrupted quietly. I do not buy slaves. I buy peace. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning she didn't yet understand. They rode until dusk, stopping by a small rise overlooking the desert plain. He built a fire and set a pot of beans to boil. Clara sat a few feet away, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the flames dance. The silence between them was thick but not cruel. When the coyotes began to howl, she jumped. Taza looked up from where he was whittling a stick and said, "They won't come close. Fire keeps them away." "I'm not afraid," she said automatically. He gave her the faintest of smiles, just a twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Yes," he said. "You are." She turned away, cheeks burning. Later, when she finally drifted into uneasy sleep beneath the stars, she woke once to find him still awake, sitting by the fire with his knife resting across his lap. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, his face soft in the flickering light. For the first time she saw not a stranger, not a captor, but a man burdened by his own ghosts. She rolled onto her side and whispered into the night, "Why me?" He didn't look at her, but his voice was steady. "Because I know what it is to be taken from home, and because I would rather save one than lose another." She didn't understand then, but his tone lodged in her heart like a seed waiting for rain. When morning came, he helped her mount her horse and they rode on toward the rising sun. The world behind her was gone. The dusty trading post, the empty promises, the father who had traded her away. Ahead lay only wilderness and a man she didn't trust, but couldn't quite hate. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the ache and fear, a question began to bloom. What kind of man buys peace with kindness instead of power? The desert had its secrets. She was about to learn every one of them. By the time they reached the valley of the Red Hills, the land had changed its color and its breath. The world no longer looked barren, but alive. Rolling ridges of blood-red stone shaped by time and wind, tall cedars bowing over narrow canyons, and a stream cutting silver through the dust. Clara had never seen land so wild or beautiful. It frightened her in a way the town never had, because it seemed to breathe. Taza slowed his horse and pointed toward a small cluster of cedars on the horizon. "Home," he said simply. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to protest, to tell him it wasn't her home, but she was too tired. Her muscles ached from days of riding, and her heart felt like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. She followed him through the grove until a cabin came into view. A modest structure built of cedar logs and adobe, with a small corral and 2 horses grazing nearby. Smoke rose from a chimney. The place was quiet, almost sacred. Taza dismounted first and offered his hand to help her down. She ignored it and swung off the saddle herself, though her legs trembled when her boots touched the ground. He said nothing, only nodded toward the cabin. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. There were 2 rooms, one with a simple cot, a stone hearth, and shelves lined with jars of herbs. The other, smaller, cleaner, almost delicate, had a bed covered with a woven blanket, a mirror cracked at the corner, and a vase of dried wildflowers. "You stay here," Taza said, gesturing toward the smaller room. "No one will disturb you." Her eyes narrowed. "You mean you won't disturb me?" He met her gaze evenly. "Yes." It unsettled her how calmly he said it. No anger, no impatience, just quiet truth. That first night she refused to eat. She sat by the window watching the light fade from the red cliffs, wondering if her father missed her at all. She thought of her mother's voice, soft and warm, telling her once that love was not always gentle. It was sometimes the thing that broke you so you could grow again. Clara didn't understand what that meant until now. Taza, sitting by the fire outside, didn't press her to join him. He ate his supper in silence, then left a plate by her door before sleeping on the porch. The coyotes howled again that night, and though she told herself she didn't care, she felt safer knowing he was there. In the morning, she found the plate untouched and cold. He didn't scold her, didn't even mention it. Instead, he handed her a cup of strong coffee and pointed toward the stream. "There is clean water," he said. "You may wash." After we ride to the herd, she frowned. "You expect me to work? You expect to do nothing?" he asked quietly. Something in his tone, steady, almost teasing, disarmed her. She took the cup, muttering under her breath, but when she caught him smiling faintly as he turned away, she felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest. Days turned into weeks. The desert slowly softened in her eyes. The hills blazed red at dawn and melted to gold at sunset. The air was rich with the scent of sage and pine. Taza taught her to ride properly, how to hold the reins loose, how to let the horse follow her body instead of her hands. He spoke little, but when he did, his words mattered. "You fight the reins," he told her one morning as they rode the ridge. "When you fight, the horse fights you. Trust him." "Trust is earned," she said sharply. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then let him earn it." That night, she brushed the horse herself and whispered a quiet apology into its mane. In the evenings, she began cooking again, at first awkwardly, then with growing confidence. The rhythm of life on the homestead settled around her, feeding the horses, tending a small garden, fetching water from the stream. There was something honest in the work, something she'd never felt in her father's store. Sometimes she caught Taza watching her, not in the way men at the saloon used to, but with quiet study, as though trying to remember her face. She wondered what he saw. Once, while sorting herbs in the cabin, she asked him where he'd learned to use them. "My wife," he said softly. The words fell like stones into still water. Clara froze. "Your wife?" he nodded. "White woman. From Tucson. She came here with her father. He was killed in a raid. I found her after." She hesitated. "And she lived here. With you?" "For 5 years," he said, his eyes distant. "Fever took her one summer. I buried her under the cedar by the creek." Clara felt a pang she couldn't name. Pity, maybe, or something deeper. "I'm sorry," she murmured. He gave a small nod. "Do not be sorry. She was not meant for this land, but she loved it, and that was enough." Silence fell between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Later that evening, thunder rolled over the hills. The wind turned sharp, carrying the scent of rain. Taza secured the horses, while Clara hurried to bring in the drying herbs. But when lightning split the sky, the younger mare panicked, breaking the corral post and bolting toward the ravine. Without thinking, Clara ran after her. "Taza," she shouted, but the storm swallowed her voice. She chased the horse through mud and thorns until her foot slipped on the wet rock. Just as she pitched forward toward the edge, a strong hand caught her wrist. Taza pulled her back with a strength that left her breathless. She collapsed against his chest, gasping as the rain drenched them both. He didn't speak, didn't scold her, just held her until her breathing steadied. When she finally looked up, his face was close, closer than it had ever been. Water dripped from his dark hair onto her cheek. His eyes met hers, and something wordless passed between them, something fierce, human, and terrifyingly tender. He released her slowly. "The horse can wait," he said quietly. She nodded, unable to find her voice. Back inside, the storm raged for hours. She sat by the fire shivering, while he tended to her scraped hands. His fingers were rough but gentle, his touch careful. When she tried to thank him, he only said, "You have fire in you. The land will like that." When the rain stopped, she watched him step outside to check the horses. Through the open door, lightning still flickered along the horizon, painting his figure in silver light. For the first time, Clara realized how lonely he must have been, living out here, surrounded by silence and ghosts. She whispered to herself, "So this is what peace looks like." The days after the storm felt different. The air between them carried something fragile, unspoken. Clara caught herself waiting for his voice, for his quiet company. She began humming when she worked in the garden, and one afternoon she saw him stop mid-stride to listen. He never said anything about it, but she noticed the corners of his mouth lift slightly before he walked on. That night, as they shared beans by the fire, she asked, "Why do you stay here alone?" He stared into the flames for a long time before answering, "Because the world beyond these hills does not forgive what I am." Clara's heart tightened. "And what is that?" "A man who has lived too long between two worlds," he said softly. Too Apache to be white, too white to be Apache. She didn't know how to respond, but she understood. In a way, she too belonged nowhere. Too proud for town gossip, too scarred to return home. When she finally went to bed that night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of the wind through the pines reminded her of something her mother once said. Sometimes love begins not with fire, but with the quiet of understanding. And as she lay there listening to the wind and his steady footsteps outside, Clara began to wonder if her heart had already started to listen. The summer sun in the red hills was fierce and golden, baking the ground until the air shimmered like glass. The stream that ran behind the cabin shrank to a silver ribbon, but the land still breathed, alive with the hum of cicadas, the scent of pine resin, and the slow pulse of life that had come to define Clara's days. By now, she had begun to move through the cabin as though she had always belonged there. Her hands found the rhythm of the mornings, lighting the fire, washing in the stream, grinding corn into flour. Sometimes she caught herself humming softly, and though she stopped whenever she realized, she knew Taza heard. He never commented, only smiled with the quiet amusement of a man who'd grown used to silence and was learning to love its disruption. She had changed. The desert had done it, not with gentleness but with truth. It stripped away her anger, her self-pity, her fear, leaving something stronger behind. She wasn't the frightened girl who had been traded like a debt. She was a woman now, learning what freedom meant, even here in the most unlikely of places. Taza, too, seemed to change with the season. The weight that always seemed to rest on his shoulders had begun to ease. He worked long hours with the horses and cattle. But in the evenings, when the air cooled and the stars came out, he would sit with her on the porch, smoking quietly, his gaze lifted toward the horizon. One such evening, as the sun bled red across the valley, he brought her something. It was a carved wooden comb, simple but beautiful, its handle smoothed by years of touch. He held it out to her with both hands. "My wife's," he said quietly. "She would want you to have it." Clara stared at it, her breath catching. The gesture was unexpected, tender in a way that made her chest ache. "I can't take this," she whispered. "It is not taking," he said. "It is keeping her memory in use, not letting it die." Her fingers brushed his as she took it, and she felt the warmth of his skin linger long after. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once, then looked away toward the setting sun. "She used to say that life here is a song," he murmured. "The wind, the fire, the rain, it all sings. But sometimes you cannot hear it alone." Clara's throat tightened. "Do you hear it now?" He turned to her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that made her heart stumble. A question, or maybe hope. "Sometimes," he said. "When you speak." She looked down, unable to hold his gaze. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was alive, like the pause before a melody begins again. As the days passed, their connection deepened in small, unspoken ways. Taza began teaching her Apache words, Tu for water, Tawa for sun, Kise for heart. She stumbled often, her tongue clumsy with the sounds, and he would correct her gently, his voice low and patient. Once, she pointed to the horizon and asked, "What do you call that?" He smiled faintly. "Zilwichi, Red Mountain." She repeated it, her accent awkward, but he only said, "Good. You listen like someone who wants to belong." She didn't answer, though the truth was she did want to belong. To something, somewhere. To someone. Sometimes he told her stories, legends of his people, of spirits who guarded the wind and animals that spoke wisdom. She would listen, fascinated, as his deep voice wove the rhythm of ancient tales into the cool night air. In return, she told him about her mother, the way she used to sing hymns while baking bread, the smell of lavender that lingered on her dresses. Taza never interrupted, just listened, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. The land, too, seemed to draw closer to her heart. The garden she tended flourished. She planted wildflowers near the cedar by the stream, and each morning she would find the petals kissed with dew. She began riding out with Taza to check the herd, learning how to mend fences and calm skittish colts. One morning, as they rode side by side, a dust storm swept suddenly over the ridge. The horses reared, the sky turned gold and red, and for a moment Clara panicked. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Then, through the chaos, she felt Taza's hand close around hers, steady, strong, guiding her through the storm until they found shelter beneath a rocky overhang. When the storm passed, the world was still and strange. Sand covered her hair and lashes. She laughed, breathless, wild, alive. Taza turned to her, his face streaked with dust, and something in his expression made her laughter fade. "You are not afraid anymore," he said quietly. She looked at him, heart hammering. "No," she said. "Not of this land, and of me." She hesitated, her throat dry. "Not as I was." Their eyes met, and for one trembling moment it felt as if the desert itself had stopped breathing. Then he looked away, his voice low. "Then the land has taught us both." Later that autumn, the valley turned soft and golden. The air grew cooler, the nights longer. One morning, Clara woke with chills burning through her body. She tried to rise, but the world spun. Fever, sharp and heavy, gripped her. Taza found her slumped near the hearth, her skin hot to the touch. Without hesitation, he carried her to her bed, fetched water from the stream, and began to tend her with quiet urgency. She drifted in and out of dreams, memories of her mother, flashes of lightning, the sound of Taza's voice murmuring in Apache prayers. She felt his cool hand against her forehead, the gentle touch of a damp cloth. When she finally woke fully, the fever broken, dawn light filled the room. Her body was weak, her lips dry. She turned her head and saw him, Taza, asleep in a chair beside her bed, his large hand still holding hers. For a long time, she just watched him. The strength of his shoulders, the lines etched into his face, the quiet peace he wore even in sleep. He looked nothing like the man she had once feared. He looked like home. When he stirred awake and saw her eyes open, a faint smile softened his face. "You came back," he said quietly. Her voice trembled. "You stayed." He nodded once, as though that required no explanation. Where else would I go? She wanted to speak, to thank him, to say something that could hold the weight of what she felt, but words seemed too small. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand over his. That was enough. From that day on, something between them had changed forever. They moved through their days as before, feeding the horses, tending the garden, but there was a warmth in every glance, a quiet knowing in every word. One night, under a sky heavy with stars, Clara finally asked the question that had lived in her heart since the day they met. "Do you regret it?" she whispered. He turned to her slowly. "What?" "Buying me," she said, her voice trembling. "Making that bargain." For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then he said softly, "I thought I was buying silence." She frowned. "Silence?" He looked at her, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Yes, I wanted peace after too many years of noise, of war, of loss, of ghosts that would not rest. But instead," he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his hand lingering for a heartbeat longer than it should have. "Instead, I found song." Her breath caught. He withdrew his hand slowly, his gaze still locked on hers. They said nothing more that night. But when Clara lay in bed later, listening to the soft wind through the pines, she touched the carved comb on her nightstand and smiled. For the first time since she could remember, she felt whole. Perfect. Here is outline 4. The town's judgment, fully expanded into approximately 1,200 words, continuing seamlessly from the last part. Outline 4. The town's judgment. Winter swept down from the mountains without mercy. The wind came first, cold and sharp, slicing through the red hills like a blade. Then the frost followed, coating the cedar branches in white, making the stream sluggish and glassy. The cabin became a world unto itself, small and warm, glowing with firelight against the endless chill. Clara had grown used to the rhythm of those winter days, chopping kindling, mending torn shirts, listening to Taza hum old Apache tunes while carving small figures from wood. Sometimes he told her the meanings of the songs, ballads of love, loss, and spirits who carried prayers on the wind. Other nights they shared stories in silence, the fire crackling between them. It was a quiet, steady life, and Clara had come to love it more than she dared admit. Yet peace in the West never lasted long. It was in January when the first rider came. Clara saw him from the porch, his dark silhouette cresting the ridge. Her heart leapt into her throat. The man rode hard, too hard for a friendly visit. Taza came out beside her, eyes narrowing. He recognized the horse before the rider even dismounted. It was Eli Monroe. Her father looked smaller than she remembered, his clothes worn, his beard streaked with gray, his face haggard from too many sleepless nights. But his eyes still carried that same desperate fire, the one she'd learned to fear as a child. Behind him rode 2 men, one wearing a badge, the other a wide-brimmed hat and a pistol that hung low on his hip. Clara's fingers clenched around the porch railing. "Pa," she whispered, disbelief and anger tangled in her voice. Eli dismounted with a grunt, ignoring her shock. "You come down here, girl," he said, his voice rough. "We're going home." Taza stepped forward, standing between them. "She has a home," he said evenly. Eli's lip curled. "Don't talk to me, Red Man. I didn't come for words." He turned to Clara, his face flushed. You think I wouldn't hear what you've been doing? You're living here like some man's wife out in the wilderness while folks in town whisper my name with shame. He'll come home if I have to drag you myself. Clara felt heat rise in her chest. You sold me, she said quietly. You sold me like a horse or a sack of grain. You don't get to talk about shame. The word struck him like a slap. He sputtered, searching for anger to hide behind.
It wasn't meant to be this way.
The deal, he wasn't supposed to keep you. He said, Taza's voice cut through the cold air like thunder. I said nothing that wasn't true. She stayed because she chose. Eli turned on him. You think that means something? She's a girl. 17, barely more than a child. You took advantage. The sheriff dismounted slowly, brushing snow from his coat. He was a heavy-set man with cold blue eyes. Mr. Monroe's come to file a complaint, he said. Says his daughter was taken against her will. That's a lie, Clara said sharply. He traded me for his debt. I didn't go willingly, but I'm not leaving now. Not with him. The deputy, thin, pale, nervous, shifted uneasily in the saddle. The sheriff's expression didn't change. Still, miss, there's the matter of law. You ain't of age. Clara lifted her chin. And what's the law to a man who sells his daughter? The words hung heavy in the still air. Even the sheriff looked uncertain for a moment. But Eli's rage was boiling over. You think you're something now, he roared. Some squaw playing house with a half-breed. You're still my blood, Clara. The insult was out before he realized its danger. Taza moved before anyone saw him, swift as a hawk. In an instant he was between Eli and Clara, his rifle leveled low. The sheriff's hand shot to his holster and the air thickened with the promise of gunfire. Taza, no, Clara cried, stepping between them. Don't. The tension stretched to breaking. Then slowly, painfully, Taza lowered the rifle. His voice was calm, but it trembled with restraint. You speak words like poison, Monroe. But poison only kills the man who carries it. Eli glared at him, breathing hard. You'll regret this, he spat. You think she'll stay when she sees what you really are? Taza's eyes didn't move from his. She already has. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should let the girl speak her mind. Ain't no law against her saying what she wants. Clara turned to face them all. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. I was 17 when he sold me. That was the law that day, wasn't it? He didn't ask me what I wanted then. Well, I'm asking you now. Look at me and tell me I'm still that girl. No one spoke. She stepped closer, her breath fogging in the cold. I came here as a debt. I stayed here as a woman. I work, I live, I belong here. You think he forced me? No. He gave me what my father never could. Choice. The wind howled through the valley, carrying her words like a challenge. Eli's face twisted with fury and shame. You'll regret this, girl, he hissed, climbing onto his horse. You'll see the day you wish you'd come home. I am home, she said quietly. He paused, something flickering in his eyes. Hurt, maybe even understanding. But it vanished as quickly as it came. He yanked the reins, turned his horse, and rode off down the trail. The sheriff followed, tipping his hat to Taza as if to say, I've seen enough. And the deputy hurried behind. When their figures disappeared into the snow, silence returned, thick and trembling. Taza turned to Clara. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark. You should not have stood between us, he said quietly. It could have gone bad. She took a step closer, her voice fierce. And let you kill him? You'd have to live with that. I wouldn't. For a moment he said nothing. Then his shoulders eased and he sighed. You are braver than most men I have known. She gave a faint, weary smile. And you are gentler than any I've ever met. He looked at her then, not with the guarded patience he'd always shown, but with something deeper. Gentle? He echoed softly. I do not know that word. She smiled again, stepping closer until the space between them vanished. Then let me teach you. He didn't move, didn't breathe. For a long moment they simply stood there in the falling snow. The world hushed around them, the fire of the cabin glowing behind them. Then slowly he reached out and brushed a snowflake from her cheek. Maybe, he said, you already have. That night, the fire burned low in the hearth. Clara sat near it, the warmth of it soft against her face. Taza sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, though his movements were slow and distracted. The storm outside had quieted, and the world beyond the walls felt still, suspended. Do you think he'll come back? She asked quietly. Taza shook his head. He has too much pride. Pride is heavier than hate. She nodded, then stared into the fire. I didn't mean to make a scene. You spoke truth, he said simply. The truth is not a scene. It is a mirror. She smiled faintly. Then what did it show you? He paused, meeting her eyes. That peace is not something you buy. It is something you earn, with trust. The silence that followed was warm. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft as ash. Inside, the flicker of firelight danced between them, casting shadows that felt almost alive. Clara thought then of how far she'd come. From a frightened girl to a woman unafraid of her own voice. And she realized something profound. The world might still see her as a girl who'd been sold. But in truth, she had bought her own freedom, one choice, one heartbeat at a time. Spring crept slowly across the red hills, cautious as a doe stepping out from the timberline. The snows melted, feeding the creeks until they sang again through the valleys. The earth softened, the air sweetened, and the smell of new grass rolled like perfume over the prairie. It had been 6 months since the day Clara faced her father. 6 months since the sheriff rode away and left her standing in the snow beside Taza, trembling and free. Life had returned to its steady rhythm, quiet, simple, honest. And yet something had changed in ways she couldn't name. The cabin that once felt like a shelter now felt like a home. Her hands no longer trembled when she touched the kettle or mended his shirt. She knew where the floor creaked, which way the wind leaned through the eaves, and how the coyotes cried before dawn. She knew Taza's footsteps before she heard them, his silence before he spoke, his heartbeat when he slept beside the fire. One evening, as the sun bled down behind the ridgeline, painting the valley in gold and rust, Clara was tending the small patch of soil they had worked into a garden. She was planting corn, each kernel pressed into the warm earth with care. Behind her, Taza watched, arms crossed, his face unreadable. You plant like my grandmother, he said finally. Clara smiled without looking up. Was she good at it? The best. She said corn listens to the hands that plant it. If the hands are gentle, the harvest is kind. She laughed softly. Then we'll eat well this year. Taza's mouth twitched, the hint of a smile. You are learning to talk like an Apache. She rose, brushing dirt from her palms. And you're learning to tease like a white man. He chuckled, a sound rare and low that still startled her every time. Maybe we are both becoming something new. That night, after supper, they sat outside as the stars came alive overhead. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of dusted silver. The fire between them was small, but its glow made the night feel wide and safe. Do you miss them? Clara asked quietly. Who? Your people. He thought for a moment. Sometimes, he said. But most are gone now. The ones who remain, they would not know me. I am too white for the Apache, too Apache for the white. Clara reached out, touching his hand. Then maybe you belong only to yourself. He turned his hand over, letting her fingers rest in his palm. And you? You miss the town? She shook her head. No, I miss what I thought it could be. I used to dream of dresses, dances, and a husband who'd call me pretty. But I've learned something. What? That love isn't something given, it's something you build. Like a cabin or a garden, one beam at a time. Taza looked at her then, his eyes catching the firelight. And what have we built? Clara smiled softly. Something that even God couldn't have planned better. He said nothing more, but his fingers tightened gently around hers. By midsummer, word had spread. The folks in town had stopped whispering about the girl who ran off with the Apache and started arguing about what really happened. Some said Taza had bewitched her. Others said he'd saved her from her father's cruelty. A few, those who knew the truth of hard living, just shrugged and said, maybe she found peace. Ain't that worth something? Still, curiosity was a strong wind, and by August, a few riders came up the trail. Peddlers, drifters, even an old preacher who said he'd been sent to bring the girl home. Clara met them all with the same calm voice. Home is where a heart finds rest, she'd say. Mine's already here. When the preacher left, muttering about sin and redemption, Taza said nothing for a long time. Finally, he spoke. Your people will never understand. Then they'll just have to live without understanding, she replied. That night, he took her hand across the table. His face was solemn. If I die tomorrow, what will you do? Clara stared at him, startled. Why would you say that? Because life here is fragile. Because I am older. Because I have seen how quickly the earth takes back what it gives. She swallowed. Then I'll stay here. I'll keep the land. I'll keep you in it. He smiled, the corners of his eyes softening. You speak like my people now. That autumn, the first child was born. A boy, strong-lunged and dark-eyed, with a face that seemed to belong to both worlds at once. Clara held him in her arms, trembling with exhaustion and awe. Taza knelt beside her, his large hands shaking as he touched the baby's tiny fingers. He will need 2 names, he said. One for your world, one for mine. Clara smiled weakly. Then you choose one. He thought for a long while. His Apache name will be Desan, Chief. It means he will lead with his heart. And for the other? She looked down at the small face and said, Matthew, after my mother's father. He was a kind man. Taza nodded. Matthew Desan. He will belong to both winds. Years passed. The boy grew wild and fearless, racing through the meadow barefoot, chasing butterflies and rabbits, asking questions that made his parents laugh and ache in equal measure. The land flourished, the cabin grew, and the scars of the past slowly healed under the sun. Sometimes travelers still came up the ridge and asked about the woman who'd been sold. But when they saw her, tall, serene, her eyes full of both fire and gentleness, they left with new stories to tell. She became known as the White Apache Woman, the one who lived beyond the border of both worlds, neither captive nor outcast, but something in between. And when her father died years later, a letter arrived from the sheriff in town. It was short, clumsy, but honest. He spoke your name before he passed. Said he was sorry. Clara read it by the fire, then folded it quietly. Taza watched her for a long time. Will you go back? He asked. She shook her head. There's nothing to go back to. He nodded. Then we stay. On the night of their 10th spring together, Taza took her to the ridge where the stars spilled like silver dust over the plains. The air was warm, the grass high and soft. He carried a bundle of white sage and cedar, lighting it with a small flame until smoke curled up into the night. This is how my people give thanks, he said, not with words, but with the breath of the earth. Clara stood beside him, her hand slipping into his. Then let the earth hear this, she said softly. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. He turned, surprise flickering across his face. Even after all that pain? Especially after, she whispered, because it led me here. He kissed her then, slow and deep, under the blanket of stars, 2 lives that had once been broken finding wholeness in each other's arms. When the wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage through the valley, Clara thought she could almost hear the spirits he spoke of, the ones who carried prayers on the wind. Maybe they were listening. Maybe they always had been.